Alright, so Israel Adesanya may be the weirdest person to hold a UFC championship that we've ever seen, because despite being an undeniably great fighter who was propped up to be the next big superstar by the UFC, Izzy has done a spectacular job at turning fans off from him as of late. Whether it be from his boring performances while he was champion, his potential steroid use, his painfully cringe trash talk, and even his suspected attraction to dogs, Izzy has seemingly lost more fans than he's gained in recent years. Let's start off with how Izzy is seen by many fans to be a boring fighter. After officially switching over to MMA after an extremely successful run in Glory Kickboxing, Izzy speed ran his way up the UFC rankings with relatively entertaining fights where he ultimately knocked out Robert Whittaker to win the middleweight title. However, Izzy immediately followed up winning the belt by having one of the most egregiously boring and lackluster title fights in UFC history against Yoel Romero. I mean, even to this day, if you look up worst UFC title fight, many fans online will be quick to mention this fight as one of, if not the worst matchups ever. Both commentators and fans, including myself, watched confused and frustrated at how tentative the fight was, where the only brief moments of action were Yoel charging at Izzy, who backed away and leg kicked the whole night. The irony of this fight is that after stopping Rob to win the belt, Izzy was being heralded by Dana White as the next big international superstar, and if you look back at Izzy's fights prior to winning the title, he had some really fun performances. His TKO over Rob Wilkinson was really impressive, he looked great when he finished Derek Brunson in the first round, and his fight against Kelvin Gastelum is genuinely one of the best fights ever, so to have his first title defense be such a snoozer was a pretty massive disappointment. Anyways, Izzy's other noteworthy boring title fights include his rematch with Marvin Vettori, which although wasn't terrible, I definitely wouldn't say it was very exciting to watch by any means. Izzy fought Marvin right after he was beaten by Jan Blachowicz in his first and only light heavyweight title shot, and after his loss to Jan, I definitely feel like this is when Izzy started to take a much more conservative approach to his fighting style. At UFC 276, Israel fought Jared Cannonier, and outside of his fight with Yoel, this is for sure one of the performances that really made fans aggravated at Izzy's conservative backpedaling style. I think this fight was particularly frustrating because although he was a noticeably better striker than Jared, and instead of actually trying to push the pace a little bit, Izzy just backpedaled and point fought the entire 5 rounds. Now you might be saying that not all of Izzy's title fights have been boring, which is true. I mean, his fight against Paulo Costa was pretty solid, even though admittedly Paulo forgot how to fight that night and let Izzy beat him up and finish him. His rematch against Robert Whittaker at UFC 271 definitely wasn't bad, but again, I really think that Izzy's ultra-conservative fighting style that he adopted after losing to Blachowicz really held him back from making the fight more entertaining. And even taking a look at his most recent fight where he lost to Sean Strickland, I thought the fight was really interesting to watch, but it wasn't because of Izzy, it was more so because of how Sean bullied him that evening. Because even though Sean was walking him down and disrespecting everything about Izzy's defense, Izzy still insisted on trying to make his backpedaling and leg kicks work, and I'm not gonna lie, in hindsight, I'm pretty happy to see Izzy's new approach to fighting get dismantled because maybe in future fights he'll come in with a new game plan that isn't just move backward and kick the legs. Honestly, the only title defense from Izzy that I would say is an actual banger is when he lost to Alex Pereira at UFC 281. And I would really argue that the only reason that this fight was a banger is because Alex is literally incapable of being in a boring fight and actually makes people fight him, so the fact that this fight was as entertaining as it was is a byproduct of Alex's fighting style, not so much Israel's. And sure, their rematch where Izzy knocked out Alex to reclaim the title was great to watch too, but again, I would say that this is because Alex is more than willing to take chances and put himself at risk in order to make fights fun to watch regardless of outcome. So let's do some math here. Out of Izzy's 7 middleweight title defenses, in my opinion, Israel just has one true banger against Alex where he lost. And his fights against Paulo, Rob, and Sean weren't bad by any means, but I wouldn't have any of them in my top title defenses for the years that they took place in. My point here being, although I appreciate Israel's fight IQ and his skills, as a champion, he didn't really give fans much to be excited for whenever he stepped in to defend his belt. As a champion, the only time where we saw him truly lay it on the line was against Alex Pereira, where he ultimately got TKO'd. Even when he was getting bullied pillar to post by Sean Strickland, and when Sean was literally screaming in his face, Izzy still backed up and tried to point fight him, which is baffling to me. I've seen people online say that Izzy is a much more entertaining fighter when he's not the champion versus when he's the champion, and just taking a look at his career, I kinda think there's some truth to that. Anyways, I can talk a lot more on this subject, but just know that I understand where Izzy haters are coming from when they say he's a boring fighter. Alright, moving on, I think interestingly enough, the thing that might have alienated Izzy from his fans the most is what I think I would call just a general sense of phoniness and lack of authenticity, and I kinda feel like this lack of authenticity has resulted in his long history of cringe one-liners and antics. I mean, from dyeing his hair pink, walking into press press conferences with French tip nails or the infamous Frozen like Elsa line, I just get the feeling that Israel is always trying to force viral moments instead of just being a real person and being honest with who he is. For example, back when Izzy was living in China and making a name for himself as a kickboxer, he started referring to himself as Chinese as a means to show appreciation for the country, and honestly, I don't have too much issue with this. However, this would come back to haunt him during his lead up to his title shot against Robert Whittaker. Israel attacked Rob's choice of representing Australia, where he lives, despite being born in New Zealand and having Maori heritage. Izzy was trying to paint Rob as a phony by saying that he's claiming to be something that he's not, which is pretty hypocritical for him to say, seeing as he quite literally did the same exact thing back when he was living in China. I mean, for God's sake, Izzy was born in Nigeria, lived in New Zealand for over 10 years, then moved to China, where he started walking out to fights carrying a Chinese flag, and he has the audacity to call out Robert for trying to represent Australia instead of New Zealand? Sean Strickland would later famously call out Izzy for his hypocrisy when he repeatedly referred to him as a Chinaman in their pre-fight press conference, which I really appreciate because Israel has no room to be criticizing anyone for wanting to represent another country. Or we can talk about how Israel likes to portray himself nowadays as someone who grew up poor in Nigeria. However, in the past, he said with his own words that his family was very well off financially. In regards to acting like he grew up in poverty, just listen to what Israel had to say here about how he has a lot in common with people who live in the favelas of Brazil.
I love my Brazilian fans. Even when I was out there, they love me. The favelas love me. They can relate to me. They understand what I've been through. But again, I'm fighting one of your own.
Also, just today, Israel has made claims in an interview with TMZ that he was supposedly some sort of Nigerian refugee and says that he and his family were forced to flee his country in search of better opportunities. Not only that, Israel also said that his upcoming opponent Dricus du Plessis will never understand that because he lives behind the fucking gates of his privileged life in South Africa.
Dricus is saying, I trained in Africa, I do this in Africa, and then people like Razak and myself who are forced to flee our own country because of, you know, a better opportunity. Yeah. He can't even, he'll never understand that because he lives behind the fucking gates of his privileged life in South Africa.
However, now listen to this interview that he did with Netflix where he says with his own words that his family was quite well off in Nigeria.
Oh, there was a time because I was quite well off. My family was quite well off in Nigeria. And I wasn't really doing too good in school, so...
And not only does he admit to growing up well off, by Izzy's own admission, he grew up with servants in his household that bathed him until the age of 8. So excuse me if I'm missing something here, but I'm struggling to see how people living in the favelas of Brazil can relate very much to a guy who grew up with servants, multiple, who presumably tended to his every need. And in regards to Izzy's newest claims that he was forced to flee Nigeria, the guy has literally gone on record saying that he and his family left the country so that he can receive higher quality education, not because they were escaping any sort of discourse.
Since then, you were born in Nigeria. As I said, I'm half Nigerian, and then you moved to New Zealand. What was the reason why your parents decided to take you out of Nigeria and move you to another country?
I think it was initially better recognized tertiary education.
It's not like Izzy and his family were uprooted from their lives, they just decided to move on their own accord. Also, I think it's pretty fucking rich of Izzy to call out DDP for being privileged when this guy had servants in his house washing him until the age of 8. I mean, compare this to Alex Pereira, who actually grew up in Brazil and overcame addiction before becoming a UFC world champion, and who now I would argue might be a more beloved fighter than Israel ever was. And this isn't because Alex has a bigger personality or has more international appeal than Izzy. I mean, Alex doesn't even speak English, for God's sake. But fans continue to flock to Alex because in a sport full of antics and theatrics, Alex has seemingly stayed true to his actual humble beginnings. Compared to Izzy, Alex is a pretty stark contrast in the way he presents himself to the world, and it's clear that fans appreciate the genuine nature that he brings. And the ironic thing about this is, even though Izzy clearly puts in a lot of effort to get people talking about him by rehearsing his cringe one-liners that he thinks are way better than they actually are and portraying himself as someone that he's not, I think fans would respond to him a lot more positively if he cut out all the bullshit and just kept it real with us. Alright, next thing I want to talk about is how the MMA guru made a really disturbing and eye-opening video on how Israel might be sexually attracted to dogs. And even though when I watched this video I went into it as a skeptic, I couldn't help but be shocked with what I saw, and yeah, it definitely makes me look at Izzy a bit differently for sure. First, Guru shows a video that Izzy himself uploaded where he plays with his dog's dick, and yeah, okay, hard stop, this is weird as hell. I have a dog, I love my dog, but at no point have I ever felt compelled to play around with his private parts. And the fact that Izzy thought it would be a good idea to not only record himself doing it, but to post it online is not just bizarre, but also pretty gross. Guru then shows there's proof of Israel following Twitter accounts that are based around dog fetish adult content. This screenshot is from a Twitter account of a girl who likes to pretend like she's a dog, and you can clearly see in the bio she's an OnlyFans content creator, and you can also clearly see that Israel was following her Twitter page. Now, this obviously begs the question if Izzy is subscribed to her OnlyFans page, where she gets into who knows what over there. Also important to note here that when MMA Guru made this video in September 2023, he confirmed that Israel was still following this girl's Twitter account, and I just checked on my own Twitter, and now Israel is no longer following that page. Looks like somebody got exposed. And finally, Guru shows a crazy video of Israel appearing on the Breakfast Club radio show, and when asked by Charlemagne if he's the type of fighter to not have sex before fights, Izzy has the following to say.
What about fucking? Does that affect
not
you?
Never, dude. Nah, man. That's a myth.
Okay.
Facts. I made records this week. I'll just leave it at that. Fight week. Not just in the fight game, not just in the cage. I was making records. Shout out to the puppy.
The puppy?
Whoa, what kind of code word was going on in the bedroom?
Shout out to her, whoever that is. At least you got a nickname, Mom.
I know.
All right.
Okay,
Shout out to the puppy.
Andrew knows what's up.
Shout out to the puppy, he said. Shout out to the puppy? Like, why would he say that? Why did he even think that would be a good idea? This is such a weird thing for Israel to say, especially on a nationally broadcasted radio show, and I can't wrap my head around what compelled him to say that on air. Like, was this just a really bad joke, or could this have been a Freudian slip where he accidentally said the quiet part out loud? Look, man, I'm not sure what to make of this whole Doggybender situation, but this Guru video definitely makes me raise my eyebrows a little bit. I mean, all three of these instances are really bizarre in and of itself, but this guy Israel really does seem to be leaving a trail of evidence that might indicate he could be into dogs. Even when it comes to his UFC appearances, Izzy has pantomimed walking into the octagon like a dog and then pretends to pee on the cage as if he were a dog, and he's also worn a dog collar to a press conference. And of course, the UFC stuff isn't all that weird, I guess, but the fact that he has 3 more instances of playing with his own dog's private parts, following a dog fetish Twitter account, and referencing hooking up with his puppy on a radio show, I can't help but wonder about the things he might be getting into when no one's watching. And I definitely think that the people who are familiar with these accusations have taken them to heart, because since the MMA Guru made this video, it's pretty hard for me to click on any Israel Adesanya video or Reddit post and not see some sort of joke being made about him being attracted to dogs. I mean, to be fair, if there somehow becomes confirmation that Izzy actually does indulge in dog fetish activities, then I don't blame anybody who can no longer support the guy. But even with the evidence that we have seen on the matter, I don't think it's all that crazy for people to be a bit wary of what Izzy's getting into that we're not seeing. Now, this wouldn't be an Israel video if I didn't talk about his very mysterious come-and-go case of gyno. Gyno, which is an instance of enlarged nipple swelling, is often a telltale sign of steroid use, and there have been several instances of Izzy exhibiting gyno in his fights. The first time fans noticed this on Izzy was during his fight against Paulo, where it's pretty noticeable that his right pec was swollen compared to his left. This immediately raised questions amongst fans, fighters, and even coaches. For example, John Jones called out Izzy and mocked him for growing breasts, clearly indicating that he thinks Izzy is taking steroids. And although John Jones really doesn't have any right to be pointing fingers at anybody when it comes to taking steroids, he's definitely not the only person to claim Izzy's gyno is suspect. Prior to Izzy's fight against Alex Pereira, MMA coach Faraz Zahabi added to the pile by saying that Izzy's gyno is very suspicious, and not so subtly accuses him of taking steroids by saying there's only one reason for this, obviously referring to steroid usage. And if Faraz Zahabi calling out a fighter for using steroids isn't enough for you, then I will give you Steroid Jesus himself more plates, more dates, saying that Izzy's sudden gyno is definitely suspicious. And in response to being called out for the suspected gyno, Izzy famously came up with probably one of the worst explanations I've ever heard in my life. According to Izzy, his right nipple became swollen from smoking too much weed. Dude, I've been smoking weed regularly for a decade now, and if excessive weed smoking caused enlarged nipples, then my nipples would be dragging on the ground whenever I walked at this point. Like, Izzy could have said nothing in response to the steroid accusations, and instead he says this. As you can probably imagine, fans far and wide ridiculed Izzy for trying to use this as an explanation explanation for his gyno, and it definitely did more harm than good because MMA fans aren't idiots and they immediately ruled this to be a lie, and it further strengthened suspicions that Israel is using steroids. I don't know, man. I know what I think about this, but I'm definitely no expert on steroids and PEDs, so I'll let you guys decide for yourselves on if Izzy is on the sauce or not. I'll say this though, in the world of UFC, you'll lose some fans for being a blatant steroid user for sure, but you'll lose even more fans if you treat people like they're stupid and claim that your gyno is from smoking too much of the jazz cabbage. And obviously, I don't expect him to admit that he's taking steroids or anything because he would be a fool if he did, but don't feed us these trash-ass lies and expect for us to eat it up. I don't know, I felt like he was insulting my intelligence a little bit when he came up with the weed excuse, and I'm sure some of you guys might feel the same way. Alright, so that's all the things that I wanted to talk about in this video. Obviously, for a video like this, I could have nitpicked a ton of small details about what Izzy said or done to try and paint him in an even worse light, but I've tried my best to keep things relatively objective. Like, I could have brought up Izzy humping Paulo Costa doggy style after he TKO'd him and made it seem like that crossed some sort of line, and maybe it did to some people, but I really don't think that's all that bad. Or I could have brought up how after he lost to Pereira, he tried to compare himself to Chadwick Boseman getting ridiculed by the media while he was battling cancer, but I'm willing to give Israel the benefit of the doubt there and just chalk that up to a really poor comparison he made up on the fly. I can even talk about how Izzy definitely is not deserving of the immediate title shot that he's been given against DDP taking place this Saturday, but that's not Izzy's fault. The UFC would rather see him fight for the belt over Strickland. But otherwise, I think when it comes to the things that I mentioned earlier, fans thinking Izzy's become a boring fighter, him trying to convince fans that his recurring gyno is from smoking weed, the Doggygate stuff, which is very weird, and his general phony vibe, all these things have kind of culminated together to make fans a bit put off by him. And for what it's worth, I think that you can be a boring fighter in the UFC and still be incredibly popular. I mean, my favorite fighter of all time is GSP, for God's sake, and his title defenses were far from electrifying by any means. But when it comes to Adesanya, I can understand why fans have cooled off from him a lot in recent years because, at least in my opinion, there's a little bit of disingenuousness to him. I don't know, obviously I think that he's a great fighter and all, but as a hardcore fan that's constantly consuming MMA content, it really seems like Israel's approval rating amongst the community has taken a downward turn in recent years. And seeing as nowadays, unless he's fighting Alex Pereira, his fights are average at best, mixed along with his questionable antics outside of the cage, I can see why Israel went from the next superstar to a fighter that many fans love to hate. Anyways, that's the video for today. Definitely let me know your thoughts on Israel Adesanya. Do you love to loathe this guy nowadays like many other fans seem to, or are you still firmly in his corner? As always, if you like the video, then like the video, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. I appreciate you guys for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.